Hi, I'm Lissa Muscatine, co-owner of Politics and Prose.
And I'm Mark LaFramboise. I'm the senior buyer here at Politics and Prose. And we're going to have our annual book banter about books that we loved the past year. Some of them we've highlighted in our newsletter, some we just loved and have loved throughout the year, and we're excited to sell them during the Christmas season.
And some of them we're going to fight over because we both love them so much. So one of us will take the lead in talking about them, and it's a mixture of fiction, nonfiction. We have one audiobook recommendation and also a cookbook recommendation. So Mark, do you want to start?
Let's talk about Say Nothing. Say Nothing appeals to people who really love history and just really taught storytelling. And she's telling the smaller story about these two sisters in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. But by telling their story, he tells a whole big, larger story about the whole thing and how the duplicity on both sides of the question of the troubles between the IRA and the British government. It's just a riveting book, and as much as any novel you're going to read this year.
He's a New Yorker writer, and it really shows the capacity for narrative and character development, and also he constructs the plot around the mystery of one of the disappeared women during the Troubles. So it's an incredible book.
You know, and they had this whole Innocence Project thing too, where people could come forward and put their testimony on tape, and then they found out that it wasn't privileged, and there was all kinds of court battles about privacy, and it was just an amazing kind of a bit of a debacle in terms of justice. Mm-hmm. But Keith tells the story so well, just incredibly well.
Yeah, really. I think it's probably one of our favorite combined between us books of the year, period.
Absolutely.
So, I'd like to call attention to two books that didn't get as much attention, both written by Obama administration officials. And by the way, Obama administration people seem to be writing really good books. Susan Royce had a memoir come out that's really good. It's also in our holiday newsletter. And one that really I want to say is a classic of the genre of memoir is Samantha Power's Education of an Idealist. It's an incredible story. Her life story is fascinating. People may not realize, actually emigrated from Ireland as a kid and grew up in a very interesting family. Her father was alcoholic, and it had a lot of repercussions on her growing up, and the way she tried to assimilate into American culture, and then got interested in genocide and human rights, and was a journalist in Bosnia for a while before she met a rising star of the Democratic Party, Barack Obama. And she became part of his universe just as he was beginning to get into the national consciousness. And of course, she went on to work in his White House and then become the United States ambassador to the United Nations. And through this all, she, of course, tries to preserve her principles. You know, she's very progressive. She's very determined on human rights. She'd written a whole book that won a Pulitzer Prize about why governments had erred and what they had done wrong, including our government, in addressing genocides around the world. So now she found herself inside government, having to make the policies she had once been critical of. But it's extremely honest. It's very open. It's very self-reflective. It's very funny. She's got a great sense of humor. And it is actually the story of the education of an idealist. A very inspiring book.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I'll talk about Yellow House. I was privileged this year to be part of the jury for National Book Award for Nonfiction. And this is what we chose as the winner for the nonfiction, The Yellow House by Sarah Broom. It's a memoir by Sarah Broom about growing up in New Orleans. She was the youngest of 12 children. And she talks about her house and this little house that somehow managed to be home and refuge for this gigantic family. So she tells the story of all of her family, all of her siblings. But by doing so, she tells the story about this whole part of New Orleans that nobody ever talks about, but where I think something like 2/3 of the population actually live in. And it was also a part of New Orleans that was devastated by hurricane. So that's all part of it too. But her story it's hard to even describe because it's memoir, but it's history, and it's she does all kinds of things in the frame of just this one book, and it's a book to be enjoyed. I mean, there were a lot of great books we were talking about. This was a really strong year for nonfiction, between Say Nothing, Solitary, all of these great books, Samantha Power. But Yellow House distinguished itself in a way that it's not only good, but it's also just a joy to read. Her voice, her everything, her personality comes through so well.
And I think this book, the National Book Award is going to give it the attention it really deserves. So I'm glad you guys picked it.
Yeah, no, me too.
Great. You know, and there's another book that was a National Book Award finalist. Actually, we have two of them here. This one's Solitary by Albert Woodfox that Mark and I also both just were blown away by. Albert Woodfox is, I believe, the person who has been held in solitary confinement longer in the history of this country than anybody who wasn't actually enslaved. Although he was enslaved in a manner of speaking. He was in the criminal justice system, which is a form of being enslaved. And he was in solitary confinement, which means 23 hours a day in a 6 foot by 9 foot cell for over 44 years. And somehow he managed to maintain his dignity and his magnanimity, his grace. He educated himself in his cell. He used his cell as a gym, as a meeting house, as a debate hall, as a meditation room, and as his own law school and university. And this man became extremely well educated. He really couldn't even read that well when he went in as a teenager. And he came out a few years ago thanks to people working on the miscarriage of justice that got him in solitary confinement to begin with, which was that he was framed for the killing of a white prisoner, a crime he had not committed. So he was finally, released. But incredibly powerful book. He's sort of like the American Mandela to me.
Right. It's a level of detail too. He really goes in granular detail about what it's like to be living this way, and the difficulty was to communicate with other people on his row of his cell block. And like you said, the education he managed to gain for himself under extraordinary conditions. I just met him a couple weeks ago, and what an extraordinary man. I mean, he has an aura about him. He's and for somebody who had to endure so much cruelty to walk out of that, you used the word grace, and I think that's appropriate. He's actually absolutely a graceful man.
Yeah, I met him when he came for our event at the store, and he had about 200 people here, and he got a standing ovation at the end, which doesn't happen that often. I think people were just absolutely moved by his sense, his dignity, the fact that he could preserve it under such conditions. So that's an awesome book too. The other National Book Award finalist is Carolyn Forche's book. Mark and I also both love this book.
Absolutely.
Do you want to talk about it, or do you want me to?
Yeah, well, she does. This was very early in her writing career. She got this opportunity to go down into Central America. In fact, she was implored to go down there to chronicle it. People knew her as a poet, but she wasn't famous yet. But she had gone down there at the bequest of somebody, and she went down there to observe and to be a witness to what was going on down there. And the things that she got herself into and that she chronicles in this book are frightening. I mean, you read this book just really fearful of her. You know she came out okay because she wrote this book and had this amazing career afterwards. But you never know quite during the book whether these situations that she finds herself in, they're absolutely perilous.
Right, and she's a poet. She lives actually in the Washington area. She teaches at Georgetown, I think, still. And it is a classic of witness testimony.
Right.
And the whole story of how, as Mark said, she was implored to go to Central America in the first place, to El Salvador, is itself insane and crazy and riveting. But basically she was recruited, in effect, by a mysterious man who remained a mystery most of the time. She knew him over many years, but they became extremely close. And he understood that Americans would not really get what was going on in Central America without the sensibilities of a poet seeing for herself what was happening there. And that's what this book is. It's really a crazy good book.
No, though she's a poet, I mean, there's nothing extravagant about her prose at all. She's just very, very careful with words, but it's just a very well-written, well-told story.
Yeah.
Tony Horwitz was spying on the South. Tony Horwitz very tragically died this past year. Actually, on the night he was supposed to read here.
Yeah.
That day, he passed away suddenly. So very, very tragic. And Tony and his wife, Geraldine Brooks, were great friends of the bookstore. And Tony and his brother and his mom used to come in here all the time, a long time ago when they were all younger. But Tony Horwitz, he tells the story of Frederick Law Olmsted, who we know as a landscape architect, perhaps the greatest landscape architect, who's responsible for Central Park and some of the other great parks in the United States. But before he was a landscape architect, he was a reporter for the New York Daily Times, which became the New York Times. And right before the Civil War, he went down south and he wanted to explore the rift between North and South, how we could be so divided. And it's a really culturally appropriate time to explore that again. And he does that, and he tries to tell the story of Olmsted, his journey. And then when he could, if Olmsted went by train, Tony went by train. And if Olmsted went by barge, Tony talked himself onto some boats going down the river. But he couldn't do that all the time. When he had to travel the way that he could. But he goes on this. So he's telling two stories. He's telling the story of Olmsted and his dramatic trip on the eve of the Civil War. And he's also talking to people in all of these places in the South about what's going on. And also, so he's telling two stories at the same time, very, very effectively. And he's absolutely just a genius at telling these nonfiction stories.
Yeah, no. And Mark, you also liked The Uninhabitable Earth, which we felt there have been some really good books about the environment, climate change this year. And so this was one that you wanted to talk about.
This is a scary ass book. Because it really lays it out, the truth about what's going on with all of these projections and how every time they've even made these predictions, they've always come up short. It's always been way worse than they've even said. And he's talking about it, I think, in very reality. And if things are worse than he says, then I fear for all of us, because he really lays it out about just how serious this stuff is and how imperative it is for people to take some action on it, because it's actually going to be, this began as a New Yorker article that many, many people read, and then it grew into this actual book, and he lays it out. If you want to know what's going on with the climate crisis, read this book. It's a very important book.
Yeah, and I'll switch gears and do something completely unpredictable and a lighter book. And frankly, I probably would not have read it had I not known the author. Another Obama administration person and friend of mine and former colleague of mine, actually, named Sarah Hurwitz. She was Michelle Obama's chief speechwriter for many, many years. It's called Here All Along, and it's a great book. Basically what happens is she's at the end of the Obama administration. She's working for Mrs. Obama. It's pretty likely she would have a chance to work with Mrs. Obama on her memoir. But she's just broken up with a boyfriend. And a friend says, why don't you come to this class with me at the Jewish Community Center? And Sarah has nothing better to do. It's a Wednesday night. She's, kind of bored and idle. So she goes along with it. This is a woman who had been bat mitzvahed and had been to Hebrew school as a kid. And that was the extent of her understanding of Judaism. But this class captivated her, and she spent the next 3 years, 4,000 hours of study of Jewish texts, of meetings with rabbis and across the spectrum of the faith, and really was trying to explore how and if Judaism had relevance to her and how it might help her lead an ethical life. And it's a fantastic story. It's the way obviously she's a great writer. She's very, very funny. She makes a lot of fun of herself, and she doesn't pretend to have the answers, but she certainly wrestles with the questions in a way that is so accessible and so thoughtful. She's a really smart book. Very easy to read, very, very entertaining, but also definitely thought-provoking. So it's called Here All Along by Sarah Hurwitz. Really love this book.
We love Sarah Blake.
Switching to fiction.
We love Sarah Blake. She sells a lot of copies. She helps pay the bills, for sure.
And she's local.
And she lives in the neighborhood.
And she's a great person.
And she shops here. So we love her for that. But the book is really fun. It's a really good book. It came out in the summer, and that kind of is a summer book, but it doesn't mean that it can't be enjoyed at this holiday time too. But the guest book, it's about several generations of a family, that a once wealthy family who owned an island. And the contemporary story going on in the story is a woman going back to the island now that the fortune has mostly faded, and they're kind of just not rich people. So he's telling two stories. So he goes back and tells a story of her grandparents at the same time, her parents and her grandparents, and a lot of the stuff that happened on the island, which is just a good, rich, entertaining story. And it brings up a lot of other issues. Like it's right on the eve of World War II, anti-Semitism, race, big time. But it's not about issues. It's about characters, and the characters that she draws here, whether from the historical or from the contemporary, they're just very real, and you can relate to them, and it's just really grand storytelling.
Yeah, she's a wonderful writer and storyteller. She has a PhD in Victorian literature, I think.
I didn't know that.
And so she's very meticulous in her study of history, and she also, weaves in, I think, a lot from her own family experience, her own personal experience. But it really is a lot about class and race and sort of against the sort of changing historical backdrop. It's a great book.
Yeah, and the title comes from the actual guest book that the daughter finds when she goes back to the house on the island, and she realizes who was all there, and is able to kind of connect a lot of the dots, and that's kind of what this story is relationships and the way that people affect one another and
families.
Absolutely.
Or families' evolutions against the backdrop of time changing. Okay, I'm going to do, we haven't really done this, but I'm going to do Ann Patchett's book. Obviously, she's famous. She probably doesn't need a push from us. But the audio version of this book is so worth listening to. I love the novel anyway. I think it's probably my favorite Ann Patchett novel. But the best part about it is that Tom Hanks is the narrator. We have it on CD at the store. You can also, if you should do this anyway, if you like listening to books, go to libro.fm, which is the website, and you can get an app on your phone or do it on your computer, and you can download pretty much every book that's available through Audible and iTunes. You can do on libro.fm, and it comes through the store. You can pick your favorite independent bookstore, and it gives credit to that store for the sale. So of course we love that. But Tom Hanks narrates it. It's a wonderful story about a kind of family that falls apart for a variety of reasons, and the relationship between the son and his sister, son and daughter, sister and brother, and how they manage over time to kind of come to terms with these various family secrets and tragedies. It's really, really well done. I liked it a lot. And again, I think probably Tom Hanks reading any book would be good, but it's really worth listening to. So that's another one. Let's see. Did you read this?
I read it.
Okay, this is another. I love this book, Rules for Visiting.
I know we sell a lot of them.
Jessica Francis King. This is a great book. People always say, "Oh, I want a book that's not dark, and I want a book that's not tragic, and I want a book that's not about the world today and all of the trauma of the current situation in this country." So this is just basically a book that has an underlying exhortation about the importance of nature and the environment and our need to tend to it. That's sort of the underlying theme. Because the protagonist is a landscaper at a local, unknown, undisclosed location college. And that's what her life is, and she lives with her father, and she's very solitary. And she gets an unexpected month off from her job as a landscaper, and she decides she's going to branch out and reconnect with 4 friends from college who she hasn't seen in decades.
Okay.
And so it becomes the journey of these friendships and the underlying sort of testament to the importance of time and patience and kind of being in the moment and not rushing things. It's really a kind of anti-modern book, but really, really smart, really clever. I really, really liked it.
Awesome.
And then this is another of my favorite books of the year, Nigerian-American author Okenyan Braithwaite. It's called My Sister, the Serial Killer. It is about a sister who's a serial killer. It turns out all of the sister's boyfriends keep disappearing, and the older sister, who's the narrator, has to kind of contend with this free-spirited, undisciplined, reckless younger sister. So it's about sisterhood, it's about family bonds, it's about what is right and wrong, it's about when do you report somebody who's doing something wrong, how do you tell if they're really doing something wrong. It's kind of comic noir. It's fairly satirical, just really, really well done. So that was one. And then...
It's a mysteries you wanted to talk about.
Oh yeah, then there are 2 mysteries. People love mysteries at the holidays. Anything by Jane Harper is great. She's an Australian former journalist. This is her 3rd book in about 5 years. It's called The Lost Man. You can read them in any order, although the previous 2 have the same detective. This one does not. Again, these are set in the outback. They're in very remote places. They are wonderful whodunits. She really keeps you guessing. She fools you. The characters are tremendous. This one also deals with pretty sensitive contemporary issues of child abuse, not graphically, nothing in this book is graphic and violent, but it's sort of the undercurrent of things that have gone wrong in a past of a family. And it's just a great whodunit. Another great whodunit is, where does it go? The Hunting Party by Lucy Foley. Perfect book for the holidays because it's set in Scotland over New Year's during a big storm when this group of friends who have gotten together every New Year's, they've been friends since Oxford days, they decide this year to go to this hunting lodge in Scotland and they get snowed in, virtually by themselves with some people who work there, and one of them ends up dead. And you don't know which one for a while reading the book, and you certainly don't know how it all happened, and that's the great mystery of the book. Also a great whodunit. And I just really, really like both of those books.
And we pulled one cookbook too.
Yeah, we pulled one cookbook. This has special meaning to me. It's called Poilâne. Poilâne is the name of a bakery in France, in Paris. A very small bakery that has a wood oven that's been going for 150 years. They make rustic bread. They don't make baguettes. And they make great croissants and stuff like that. The grandfather of this author, the author's name is Apollonia Poilâne. The grandfather made the bakery famous. He was a friend of a lot of Impressionist artists. Oh. He has letters from Impressionist artists in a collection that has, there were paintings. They would decorate envelopes when they sent him letters. He passed the business on to his son named Lionel. Lionel really expanded the business. It became popular. A lot of restaurants in the United States imported the bread. A lot of the main restaurants in France, the really good restaurants, would use his bread. And so he was really almost a household name. He and his wife were tragically killed in a helicopter crash when he was in his 50s. This was about 20 years ago. And leaving the business to their daughter, Apollonia, who was 17 at the time, I believe. And she had been admitted to Harvard from Paris. So she went to Harvard and ran the business as a student at Harvard and has continued to run it and made, just continued this incredible tradition. And this is her book. It's a book of the bread and its history, the bakery's history, the bread's history. It has a foreword by Alice Waters.
Your friend.
Yeah, and it has a blurb from Ina Garten. So she's, clearly making her mark. But it's a beautiful, beautiful book. Really nice for anybody who likes to bake or loves bread.
That's all we got.
Well, we really hope you enjoy these titles and many, many others. We have a lot on display on the floor. You'll see our holiday newsletter. You can find dozens and dozens and dozens of others we recommend. Of course, there are more that we didn't have a chance to recommend. Feel free to ask our booksellers on the floor. They always have great suggestions. And we hope that you find some wonderful titles for you and your friends and loved ones and enjoy the holiday season of incredible season of books.
Seems like we say this every year, but this was a really good year for books. I dread the year when it's not going to be, because it's, this is a particularly good, we talked about particularly good nonfiction year. Yeah. But there were some great novels too. There's just so much great stuff that we hope that when you're choosing gifts for the people that you love, that you'll come to your local bookstore, maybe ours.
Yeah, hopefully ours.